The Great Depression. The 1920s were incredible. Jazz was hot, skirts were short, and everyone was getting rich. The stock market only went up. People were buying shares on margin, meaning they'd put down 10% and borrow the rest. What could possibly go wrong? But something really bad eventually happened. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. 16 million shares got dumped in a single day. The ticker tape machines couldn't keep up. They were 90 minutes behind reality. Brokers were jumping out of windows mid-trade because by the time they saw the prices, they were already ruined. Banks failed overnight. Life savings vanished. And America went from the roaring 20s to eating shoe leather. Welcome to the Great Depression. Unemployment hit 25%. People built shantytowns out of scrap metal and cardboard, calling them Hoovervilles to mock President Hoover. Starving families ate their pets. In one camp in Washington, D.C., World War I veterans set up tents demanding their war bonuses early because they were broke and desperate. Hoover's response? He ordered the army to torch the camp. Generals MacArthur, Eisenhower, and Patton led the charge, using tear gas on American veterans. An infant died in its mother's arms. Out west, the Dust Bowl turned the Great Plains into a nightmare. Years of over-farming stripped the topsoil, and when the droughts hit, the dirt just blew away. Black blizzards of soil rose 10,000 feet high, blocking out the sun. People suffocated in their own homes. Rabbits overran the fields, so desperate farmers organized bunny drives, clubbing thousands to death for food. But here's the thing. While regular Americans were starving, some people got filthy rich. J.P. Morgan and other elite bankers bought up crash stocks for pennies on the dollar. Morgan alone made the equivalent of $50 billion. And there's a theory that the Federal Reserve engineered the whole crash to wipe out small banks. 9,000 banks failed. And guess who bought them up? The big guys. Morgan consolidated power. Then FDR came in with his New Deal. He launched massive government programs to put people back to work, building dams, roads, and bridges. But he also did something wild. Executive Order 6102. He made it illegal to own gold. The government seized 500 tons of private gold from citizens, and if you got caught hoarding it, you faced 10 years in prison. So what came from this disaster? The Great Depression forced America to completely rethink its economy. Social Security, unemployment insurance, banking regulations, all born from the ashes of economic collapse. The suffering of millions built the safety nets we rely on today. The Trail of Tears. The year is 1830. Andrew Jackson has just signed the Indian Removal Act, and the Cherokee Nation is about to experience one of the darkest chapters in American history. Over the next 2 decades, over 100,000 Native Americans would be forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands in the southeast to territories west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee called it Nana Dal Tsuni, meaning the trail where they cried. In the winter of 1838, soldiers rounded up Cherokee families at gunpoint, giving them minutes to gather belongings before being herded into camps. Then came the march, over 1,000 miles in sub-zero temperatures, with inadequate food, clothing, and shelter. Bodies piled up so fast that frozen ground made burial impossible. Soldiers just left them for the wolves. Private contractors were paid $67 per live Indian delivered to Oklahoma. Dead ones didn't count. So some guards shot stragglers to save wagon space and keep the pace moving. At Fort Cass, smallpox-infected blankets were accidentally distributed. Death rates tripled within 48 hours. Some Cherokee mothers, watching their babies freeze to death in their arms, chose to end their own lives rather than witness more suffering. Of the 16,000 Cherokee forced to march, roughly 4,000 died along the way. In 1971, a mass grave was discovered in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, filled with 3,000 unmarked skeletons, 80% of them children under 10. But here's where it gets even darker. The night before the Cherokee departed, $6 million in gold vanished from their tribal treasury. It was signed over to Andrew Jackson's political allies through a secret amendment to the Removal Act. The stolen land? It's now where Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport sits. Every plane that takes off rolls over Cherokee bones. So what came from this nightmare? The forced relocation opened up 25 million acres of land for cotton farming, which fueled the Southern economy and made America a global cotton superpower. It also set a precedent for manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to expand westward, eventually leading to the acquisition of California, Texas, and the entire Southwest. The Trail of Tears didn't just reshape the map, it funded an empire, and most Americans have no idea they're flying over a graveyard. The Civil War. The year is 1861. America is tearing itself apart, brother against brother, father against son. Over 600,000 men would die in the bloodiest conflict on American soil. But the horror went far beyond the battlefield. At Andersonville Prison in Georgia, 13,000 Union soldiers died in just 14 months. Guards ran betting pools on how long new prisoners would survive. Men drank from the same stream they defecated in. Some resorted to cannibalism. The camp was designed for 10,000 prisoners, but held 33,000 at its peak. Then there's Lincoln's final days. 3 nights before John Wilkes Booth shot him at Ford's Theater, Lincoln told his cabinet about a recurring dream. He walked through the White House, hearing people sobbing. When he reached the East Room, he saw his own corpse lying in state, soldiers whispering, "The president is dead." But here's what they don't teach you. When the Confederacy collapsed in April 1865, $9 billion in gold vanished. Confederate President Jefferson Davis fled Richmond with a Treasury convoy. The gold never made it to its destination. A secret society called the Knights of the Golden Circle allegedly buried it across 200 sites from Georgia to Oklahoma. Treasure hunters are still searching today. During the Battle of Shiloh, something strange happened. Wounded soldiers lying in the mud noticed their injuries glowing blue in the dark, and those with glowing wounds healed faster than others. Doctors were baffled. It wasn't until 2002 that scientists discovered bioluminescent bacteria in the soil that actually fought infections and saved lives. Soldiers called it angel's glow. Meanwhile, up north, chaos erupted. When Lincoln instituted the draft in 1863, New York exploded into riots. Irish immigrant mobs, angry they were being forced to fight a war to free slaves who might take their jobs, went on a rampage. They burned down a black orphanage and lynched African Americans, hanging bodies from lampposts with signs reading, "This is what Lincoln wants." Over 120 people were killed in 5 days of violence. And here's the conspiracy nobody talks about. Confederate agents secretly met with British officials in Canada, offering unlimited cotton exports if Britain would invade the North. Britain reportedly agreed, then every document from that meeting was burned. Makes you wonder what else got erased from the history books. But out of all this bloodshed came something unexpected. The Civil War forced America to industrialize overnight. Railroads expanded, factories boomed, and the federal government gained power it never had before. The war that almost destroyed America actually created the framework for it to become a superpower. The Lincoln Assassination. Abraham Lincoln saved the Union. He freed the slaves. He held America together when it was ripping apart at the seams. To many, he was the greatest president who ever lived. And on April 14, 1865, just 5 days after the Civil War ended, someone put a bullet in his head. John Wilkes Booth walked into Ford's Theater, slipped into Lincoln's box, and shot him, point blank. He then jumped onto the stage, breaking his leg in the process, and screamed, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. He escaped into the night. What followed was a 12-day manhunt that ended with Booth being shot in a burning barn. But here's where it gets weird. Booth kept a diary during his escape. When authorities recovered it, 36 pages were torn out. One surviving line read, "The man in the War Department knows too much." That man was Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, the same guy who led the investigation into Lincoln's murder. And Booth wasn't working alone. The same night Lincoln was shot, another conspirator, Lewis Powell, broke into Secretary of State William Seward's home and slashed him 5 times across the face and neck. Seward only survived because he'd been in a carriage accident days earlier and was wearing a metal neck brace that deflected the blade. Blood soaked through 3 mattresses. Another conspirator, George Atzerodt, was supposed to unalive Vice President Andrew Johnson that same night, but chickened out. And here's the thing. Booth's suppressed diary allegedly claimed Johnson was in on the whole plot. Stanton buried that information. Mary Surratt, who ran the boarding house where the conspirators met, became the first woman executed by the U.S. government. Her hood was soaked with tears before they dropped the platform. Her son escaped to Europe and became a papal guard at the Vatican, living under a fake name for the rest of his life. Mary Todd Lincoln, who was sitting next to her husband when he was shot, screamed so loud that blood vessels in her eyes burst. She wore a black veil for 17 years and reportedly whispered to Lincoln's ghost every night until she passed. In 2012, a blood-stained curtain fragment from Ford's Theater was tested. The DNA matched. It was still Lincoln's blood. And the conspiracy theories? They've never stopped since then. The Great Chicago Fire. Chicago was the jewel of the Midwest, a booming metropolis built almost entirely out of wood. Wooden buildings, wooden sidewalks, wooden everything. The city had gone 13 weeks without rain. Everything was a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. October 8th, 1871, a fire breaks out on DeKoven Street. For over a century, the story went that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern. But in 1997, the city officially cleared her name. Turns out a man named Daniel Sullivan, a known arsonist with ties to land speculators, was likely responsible. Some believe the fire was deliberately set so wealthy investors could buy up burnt property cheap and rebuild. What happened next was hell on earth. The flames created a fire vortex, a literal tornado of fire spinning at 1,000 degrees. The heat was so intense that iron beams in fireproof buildings melted like candles. People jumped into the Chicago River to escape, but the water boiled. They cooked alive. Skulls fused to sidewalks and twisted shadow poses. Looters were shot on sight, and over 200 bodies were dumped into Lake Michigan with no records kept. 300 people died officially, but the real number was likely much higher. 100,000 were left homeless. A third of the city was ash. Here's the part they don't tell you. That same week, 5 other major fires broke out across the Midwest. The Peshtigo Fire in Wisconsin ended 2,500 people, more than 8 times Chicago's death toll, but barely made the news because Chicago grabbed all the headlines. Some historians believe an insurance fraud ring orchestrated multiple fires to collect massive payouts. But out of the ashes came something revolutionary. Chicago rebuilt fast, and when they didn't use wood. Architects like Louis Sullivan pioneered steel frame construction, creating the world's first skyscrapers. The modern city skyline was born from 17,000 graves. Chicago's destruction forced America to build upward, and that innovation spread to every major city in the world. 9/11. September 11, 2001 is arguably America's biggest controversy of the 21st century, the day that changed everything. 2,977 people lost their lives. Read that again. 2 planes hit the Twin Towers, another hit the Pentagon, a 4th crashed in Pennsylvania. The official story is that 19 hijackers with box cutters pulled off the most devastating attack on American soil. But the more you look into it, the more questions pile up. Let's start with the towers. Both collapsed in near freefall speed, pancaking straight down into their own footprint. That's not how buildings fall. Then, 7 hours later, World Trade Center 7, a 47-story building that wasn't hit by a plane, collapsed the exact same way. Fire damage, they said. But here's the weird part. The BBC reported its collapse 26 minutes before it actually fell. The building was still standing in the background while the reporter announced it had collapsed. They called it a feed error. Then there's the Pentagon. A massive Boeing 757 supposedly hit it, but the hole in the building was only 16 feet wide. Where were the wings? Where was the wreckage? And conveniently, the section that got hit was under renovation and mostly empty. That same section housed the offices investigating the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld announced missing the day before. The audit records? Vaporized. Flight 930, the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back, "Let's roll." Todd Beamer's famous last words. The cockpit voice recorder cuts off with 31 seconds of silence. But here's what doesn't add up. The debris field was 8 miles wide. Plane crashes don't scatter wreckage over 8 miles unless something breaks apart midair. Some believe it was shot down by U.S. fighters, and the government covered it up to avoid public backlash. Now let's talk about the dancing Israelis. 5 men were arrested in New Jersey after witnesses saw them filming the towers and celebrating as they burned. Their van contained $4,700 in cash, box cutters, and maps with certain locations circled. They were held for weeks, then quietly released. The FBI report on them? Buried. And then there's Saudi Arabia. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. For years, 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report were redacted. When they were finally released in 2016, they revealed that the wife of Saudi Prince Bandar had wired money to 2 of the hijackers. But instead of invading Saudi Arabia, we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. Here's the big one. In September 2000, a think tank called the Project for the New American Century published a report saying America needed a new Pearl Harbor to justify military expansion in the Middle East. Who were the signatories? Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, all were key members of the Bush administration. A year later, they got their Pearl Harbor. On the morning of 9/11, NORAD was running 54 military drills, including one called Vigilant Guardian that simulated hijacked planes crashing into buildings. When the real attacks happened, there was mass confusion. Fighter jets were sent in the wrong direction. Response times were delayed. Coincidence? Well, maybe. Look, maybe it's all just a series of tragic coincidences, or maybe the official story doesn't add up. Either way, 9/11 reshaped America. The Patriot Act gave the government sweeping surveillance powers. We invaded two countries. Trillions were spent. And 20 years later, we're still asking questions. Thank you for watching. Please click the subscribe button if you want more of this.